G'day you mob, and welcome to the very first episode of The Goss. Guys, this is something that I have decided to put together with my father, Ian Smissen, where we'll be discussing each week's news and current affairs from down under in Australia. So the whole point of this series will be to educate you guys about what's happening currently in Australia and also help you discuss these things with other people in English, right? You can listen to these episodes, you can learn the vocab, you can improve your comprehension of these issues and develop your own opinions. So today I sit down with my dad and we have a good old chinwag about the bushfire crisis in Australia that's happening at the moment. That seemed like the best story to do for the very start of the Goss series. Anyway, guys, I know you're going to love this episode, so sit back, relax, grab yourselves a cuppa, get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and let's get into it. So, Dad, g'day. Welcome to this episode of Aussie English.
G'day, Pete. Good to be back.
It's good to have you here.
Yeah, well, yes, given the weather outside.
I know. So, get your drinks open. I guess, I don't know if you're going to have that kombucha or not. But...
Oh, yeah, why not?
So, this is going to be the first episode.
Sound effects, nothing else.
The first episode, I guess, of something like Chinwags with Dad. I don't know what we'll call it.
I'm sure we can come up with a worse name than that.
But the basic idea...
This one's good. Hang on. What have we got here? It's surprising me.
The kombucha, yeah.
Apple, pear and ginger.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Cool.
Especially with no sugar, so it's nice and dry.
Yeah.
So today the whole point was talking about, well, I guess the whole point of these episodes was to talk about current affairs, things going on in Australia, because you're a fountain of knowledge.
Ha!
And very hard to stop talking as well.
Well, what I don't know, I just make up. So
exactly.
I'll leave it to your listeners to work out what's the truth.
They can Google it afterwards. But I thought it would be a good excuse to, one, have another speaker on the podcast, and obviously have banter about things going on in Australia. This week, we were going to try and come up with a few stories, but there doesn't really seem to be much else on the news.
There's one story at the moment.
Yeah, and so I guess we're going to be talking about the bushfire crisis in Australia at the moment. So I guess to give a bit of background to people, it started in I've got some notes here, September last year.
Yeah.
About the end of spring, right?
Yeah,
2019.
September in southeast Queensland, northern New South Wales. And it's just really just followed its way south as the summer has kicked in. It's certainly the earliest that I can remember. There will always be debates, and depending on which side of the political fence you sit, whether they're defending themselves or the opposition attacking the government, the words worst and hottest and so on will keep coming out. But certainly in my 60 years of living in Australia, I can't remember a bushfire season starting in the middle of spring.
And you've lived through obviously quite a few of these, like
4 or 5 major bushfire seasons, not just single bad fires, which happen every year, but seasons where we have millions of hectares that are being burnt out, and people losing lives and significant loss of property and wildlife and livestock and so on.
So some of these include Ash Wednesday. Which was before I was born, I think.
It was. The Ash Wednesday was actually on our honeymoon. Your mum and I were on our honeymoon. And
so I might have been on the way.
No, you weren't. But so you're a few years after that. But, true. And look, we can talk about that if you sort of mental note to talk about that, because there's some interesting stories, just the human interest type stories that have come out of that, and our experience of that.
Because I remember growing up always hearing about Ash Wednesday. Obviously, I wasn't there, but that was like, a big thing with what were the stats from Ash Wednesday? Like a few dozens of people who died.
Yeah, dozens of people died.
Hundreds of houses.
Yeah, hundreds of houses. And again, it's the scale. Obviously the personal tragedies. You can't. If one person dies, it's a tragedy.
Yeah.
And the loss of livestock, property, houses, and so on is always tragic. But I think when it starts to be across multiple states, Ash Wednesday was South Australia and Victoria.
Ah, okay.
And so you have multiple fire fronts that are just creating this sort of huge balls of smoke that last for weeks.
Yeah.
And it's the same now. We had similar in 2009.
So that was Black Saturday, right?
That was Black Saturday. And that was the hottest I have ever remembered. we had the hottest temperature in the world that day in Melbourne. It was 52 degrees in the southwest suburbs of Melbourne, and that's just unheard of. And it was 1% humidity. And that's the problem that we have with bushfires. Obviously, every year in summer there are going to be fires because it gets hot and dry. But when you have those extreme temperatures, extreme dryness over a long period of time, it just means that you've got a huge amount of fuel, and all it requires is one spark, whether it's accidentally lit, deliberately lit, whether it's come out of summer storms. Dry lightning, as they call it, is a huge cause of bushfires. Unfortunately, one of the biggest causes is idiots, people lighting fires either accidentally or deliberately.
And malfunction with technology, right? Especially the electrical grid. And
and there's been a few cases of that happening.
So how has it changed from when you were growing up? So you remember there obviously being a bushfire season, and every year, there were always bushfires.
There's always bushfires, and then every decade or so there's a sort of a major conflagration like we have at the moment. But this one is it's really the earliest, because typically our bushfire season was late January through to March, the end of summer.
Because the summer would have dried everything out, right?
Whereas we've had probably 2.5 decades of cyclical drought in southeastern Australia. Not every location has been in drought for 25 years, but you remember what we were like 10 years ago in southern Victoria. We were in drought for 10 years.
Well, that was when we had water restrictions.
Yeah, huge
I remember
water restrictions.
Not being allowed to wash your car on certain days
your cars.
or certain times.
Eventually, where we were living, you couldn't wash your cars at all. You couldn't wash houses. You couldn't water the garden unless you had tank or bore water. You couldn't use mains water for anything other than just normal household usage or commercial usage if you were in a business. So those sort of things have happened, but when the drought broke where we are, it really just moved north. And so, New South Wales and southern Queensland and parts of South Australia have been in drought for the last 10 years. And we're talking about in some places where it has not rained for 10 years. There has been, typically the usual working definition of a drought is that less than the annual rainfall, on average annual rainfall. And if you have that in multiple years, it's considered to be a drought. But we're talking about no rain. Not just a less rain. So
I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to be thinking, why does that happen here in Australia? Why are there these places where it doesn't rain for so long?
Yeah, well, we're talking about places that in a human time frame, as in since Indigenous Australians have been here, so we're talking 50,000 plus years, those areas have transitioned from being grasslands through to desert. And that desert is expanding as our climate has changed. Over the last 20 or 30 years, though, with these significant droughts, we're talking about farmland that has traditionally been in getting rainfall every year, and you can grow crops and so on. Sometimes they're in irrigation areas, sometimes they're not. But now we're getting those places in areas where there's just no rain. And those places are not in real danger of fire because there's nothing to burn. But what that means in places where there are forests, and traditionally forests require a fair amount of rainfall, but if you've got a place where it hasn't rained for months over winter, which would typically be spring would typically be our wettest months in those areas, you've got places where it hasn't rained for months and then it starts to get hot. All of the undergrowth is either dead or dry. And so all you need is a spark and it goes. And eucalypt forest, which is most of our forests, eucalypt forests, because of the oil in eucalyptus leaves, explode into flames.
And that's an adaptation, right? So that they burn quicker.
They burn quicker,
so that the
hotter.
Plants don't die themselves.
The plants don't die themselves.
Usually.
But when you're getting... we're getting temperatures in these fires because of the amount of material that is burning in them that is just beyond that capacity.
Well, some of the insane stuff, to jump into the human stories of this, was that I've seen on the news, say cars that had aluminium engines or parts of the engine that were aluminium, or the wheels, the hubs on the cars, aluminium just melted onto the ground everywhere, running down the hill. Looks like mercury or something.
Yeah, so if you're getting temperatures over 1,000 degrees Celsius in these fires, and they're burning for so long in places because there's enough fuel for them to burn. It's not like they just blast through and they're gone in seconds or minutes; they're burning for hours. And so that, it's ridiculous, the damage that has been done.
Well, and there was another story of someone, I think, out in East Gippsland who had a kiln. They made pottery and they'd left the pottery outside of the kiln in order to, before it had been, what's the word? Fired.
Yeah, it's been dried.
And then it was naturally fired by the bushfire. So when they came back, the pottery that was just clay, wet clay prior
ceramic pottery
was ceramic because of the heat.
Yeah, I know.
Just insane.
It's crazy. Yeah.
So some of the stats, I guess we've lost 16 million acres, which is almost 65,000 square kilometres.
Yeah.
Right, which is sort of the equivalent of the southern portion of Great Britain. Right,
2/3 of England.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to put that in context, almost the size of Belgium, I think someone was saying.
Yeah.
It was massive, right? You know, it's the equivalent of... And I remember them talking about...
it's as big as about 1/3 of the states in the United States, the smaller states.
Yeah.
As big as, or bigger than any of those individually.
Yeah, it's insane. And when we were worried about the Amazon burning... That was, I think now it's probably about 1/10 of what Australia's lost, what was going on with the Amazon. So we've had probably 500 million animals. We're likely...
And that's vertebrates.
Vertebrates, exactly. Not insects or plants.
Insects, plants, yeah.
Yep.
So,
2,500 buildings, including 1,300 houses. 25 people have died. 6 people are still missing in Victoria. And then we have obviously the smoke and air quality issues. We've got smoke reaching New Zealand across
2,000 kilometres of sea. And look, we have, where we are, we're hundreds of kilometres from the major fires in South Australia and eastern Victoria.
Yeah.
But look out your window at the moment. We've got a visibility of probably 400 metres.
Yeah, so that was what surprised me. I wasn't expecting that. But then when I obviously... realised that Kangaroo Island and some other places in South Australia are up in flames as of a week or so ago. That smoke's potentially arrived
because
here.
Typically our weather comes from the west, and so that air mass will move over from the west. But then we get daily on whichever the direction the wind is going, that will come in as well. And at the moment it's very still, so I think it's that air mass coming in from South Australia. Yeah,
it was very funny waking up this morning and Kel's like, "Can you smell the smoke?" And I'm like, "I can't inside." And then as soon as I went outside and I was like, "Wow, it smells like someone's got they're burning a fire in their backyard or something." Yeah. So Sydney's been covered in haze for weeks as well.
And Canberra.
Now, I looked this up this morning. So the normal air quality index, however they measure that, is numerically that's safe is 66. Yeah. 200 is hazardous, and Canberra has peaked at 7,700 and is worse than Delhi in India, Lahore in Pakistan, and Shenyang in China. Yeah. Isn't that just crazy?
Yeah, it is.
So, what's that? 66 times, 33 times worse than is safe. And Chris Moy, chair of the Australian Medical Association's Ethics and Medico-Legal Committee, has said that there are already people probably dying from smoke inhalation, those who are already at the end of lung capacity issues. Yeah,
and that's probably a good sort of prompt to talk about what people can do in these circumstances.
In terms of smoke?
In terms of, how do you cope with bushfires?
Yeah.
Now, obviously, if you're just your average person living in a city like Canberra, it's a middle-sized city. It's, nearly 300,000 people.
Yeah, it's bigger than Geelong, so about that.
Yeah. You're not expecting to be directly affected by fire.
Yeah.
Yes, there have been fires in Canberra because Canberra has got a lot of bushland and stuff around it. But if you're living in a suburban area, you don't expect to be directly affected. But all of a sudden, you're living with air quality that people can die from. And so you need to take the appropriate precautions for that. And that's typically not in somebody's fire plan. Because you don't have a fire plan if you live in suburbia, typically.
Well, that's us here, right?
Yeah. We're never going to suffer directly from a bushfire here.
Yeah, because there's no bush.
There's no bush. Or the bush is, we've had fires in the last remnant of bush on the Bellarine Peninsula, which is 2 kilometres from us.
Yeah.
But all you saw was a bit of smoke in the air because it's not significant in size. But we can be affected by fires hundreds of kilometres away by air quality. So that's a matter of knowing your own medical conditions that are likely to be affected, typically people with respiratory disease, asthma being the most problematic one, because asthma is typically triggered by a whole lot of things, but particulates in the air are one of those common ones.
Well, we had that maybe a year or two ago, where we had massive dust storms, right, that were coming eastwards towards the larger cities, and there were some tragic stories of, say, I I remember a young girl of 16 years old dying on her front yard because she had an asthma attack from the dust in the air.
Yeah, and that one was exacerbated as well by dry lightning.
Yeah.
Because lightning affects the, and I'm not an astrophysicist here, but lightning and thunder, obviously thunder is what we hear, lightning is the actual event. It affects the quality of the air by doing something to the particulates as well. I think it electrifies them and they clump together so the particulates get larger. And
really?
Yeah, and that's something that, I'm asthmatic, but I'd never heard of it. I'm 62
So it's like static
years old.
electricity, right?
Yeah,
Making things attracted to one another.
So that the problems that you have in the atmosphere get worse. So all of a sudden now that's something, we're getting warnings for asthmatics that come out saying, look, there is thunderstorm activity. And if that thunderstorm activity is coincident with already having smoke or smog in the air, then it is likely to affect people.
It's very bizarre though, isn't it? Because it's kind of like the smoke isn't something most people plan for, as you say, and it's almost like, I know you with your parents, both of your parents were heavy smokers, and as a result, you never smoked, but you suffered from asthma.
Yeah,
likely,
at least it was exacerbated by that.
And everyone knows secondhand smoke is a big deal, right? You wouldn't smoke inside a car with the windows shut with your kids in the back, at least most people. But that's almost what's happening here with bushfires.
Yeah.
And that the average person like me who thinks, oh, well, the bushfires aren't going to affect me because there's no bush here to burn, you forget that the smoke is quote unquote like secondhand cigarette smoke, which could just, linger over like if I were living in Canberra, the fires aren't there, but you're inhaling probably the equivalent of a pack or two a day if you just go outside.
Enormous amounts of particulate matter.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, that's crazy. So do you want to switch gears onto climate change?
Yeah.
And talk about, I guess from when you were younger, was climate change a worry? Was it associated with the bushfire season? Was there anything going around where you were worried about that exacerbating things at the time?
No, really. From my memory, the first times that we started, and I used to be a high school science teacher, so the first time we started to think and talk about human-induced climate change was in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So when I was a child in the 60s, we didn't think about climate change. We didn't even think about looking at data to see if there was any climate change. You just expected that there would be differences annually, and those differences would be plus or minus the norm, which is what climate is. It's just the averaging of weather. And so we didn't really think about that. But now we're obviously highly concerned about these things. And look, climate change doesn't cause bushfire. What it does is
in any individual
bushfire. Yeah, because climate change is averaging. And
that's like saying, though, that argument too, where people say, well, climate change isn't responsible for this bushfire. That's kind of like, well, any single cigarette isn't responsible for your
lung
cancer.
Yeah, well, exactly. Or at least the one that is, you can't identify because it happened 20 years ago. But when we start to talk about where we've got bushfire seasons over the last few years have been starting in early to mid-spring, where we have drought that is just much more significant than has been occurring in Australia, where we have areas in the country where it hasn't rained for months, where you would have expected significant amounts of rainfall, and that means that you just get hotter and drier summers, and that means any bushfire that occurs is going to be larger and more dramatic.
Yeah, well, that's great. So when did you start noticing that, or at least when did the public when did it reach the zeitgeist, I guess, of, people realising that climate change is actually going to have a significant effect on even Australians, whether or not, sea level change and all that sort of stuff will affect us, but bushfires now, where
sea level rising was the first one that people talked about. And there are places in Australia that will be affected by rising sea levels directly. Obviously, there are far more of our Pacific neighbours that will be directly affected. There are countries where the highest point on these islands is tens of metres. Yeah. And so significant parts of their country is just going to disappear if the sea level rises a metre. And evidence of sea level rising is always going to be debated by people because, again, it's an averaging thing.
But we're already seeing it in places like Bangladesh, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where and it's one of those things where it's inch by inch. and entire areas of farmland, even though you can still walk there, because the sea level's risen, it's increased the salinity of these places, and they can't grow food, and it's unstable. They can't build houses,
right. And the annual flooding, which occurs from flooding rivers, lasts longer because the water's got nowhere to go.
And it gets exacerbated by natural events like hurricanes and everything too, which raise the sea level.
And look, there have been things where we've been watching glaciation disappearing. Glaciers in New Zealand, Canada,
especially now that they're red and brown Greenland, from the smoke.
Exactly. Those glaciers are disappearing in my lifetime significantly. Places in New Zealand that I went to in the 1970s where you could walk from in a couple of the glaciers on the South Island, you could walk from the little tourist office, where you bought your ticket to go and visit the glacier, and it was a few hundred metres walk. Now you've got to get in a bus and travel kilometres to get to them, and so those glaciers have retracted quite significantly. And the same thing in Canada, and the same thing in Greenland, Antarctica. So we are definitely losing ice, and losing ice is a pretty good indicator that the temperature is rising. Now we're getting to the point in Australia, in Western North America, in Canada and the United States, where the bushfire seasons are just getting longer. We've had California; they were having huge bushfires months after summer, September, October,
because of that drying out.
The drying out, and the winter was just dry. It didn't rain, and so if you didn't get bushfires in the summer, it meant that all of that material was just there to keep burning when you did get fire. I've got a second cousin who lives in California. She was evacuated from her house in October. That's unheard of.
True, because for them that's winter,
right?
Or at least
it's going into winter. Yeah. So those sort of things are, yes, they're all anecdotal, and those individual anecdotal stories can always be argued about not being evidence, but they are anecdotally, they're anecdotal evidence to suggest that something is happening when you start to pile a whole lot of them together. And that's not scientific evidence, but when you combine it with the scientific evidence that can say, yes, this is a problem, then it is. So
it's pretty crazy. I've got some figures here up on the screen where you can see all of the major bushfires and how many houses and deaths there have been. And, since records began in 1918, it really has ramped up, where every single year now it seems like we're losing, potentially hundreds of houses and quite often quite a few people. So do you think too that climate change is obviously going to come to the forefront for the population of Australia, where previously it may not have been an issue, but now so many people are going to be going to have been affected by these bushfires that it's going to become unavoidable.
Yeah, and look, those figures at face value look like a problem, but the counter argument to those is always, well, the population is increasing, so there are more buildings and more people and so on, and more likely to be affected, which is all true, but they are indicative that we do have a problem.
But that's also not necessarily an argument, because the population's increasing and we're living in more areas that are already susceptible to bushfires. That's still a problem, right? Even if the bushfires remain the same.
It's still indicative. So, and we can't, even if you're right, even if nothing was actually changing with our climate and the bushfire regime, the fact that we now have more people living in areas that are likely to be affected means that it is a bigger problem. And when you then combine that with the other part of the story, which is that there are differences in what's going on. The bushfires are worse. They're happening earlier. They are more likely to happen at an increasing rate over the next few decades unless we do something.
Well, and going on from there, I saw this on Reddit. G'day, mate. That was the first half of this episode of The Goss. If you would like to continue watching or continue listening to this episode, make sure that you sign up for the premium podcast or Academy memberships at aussieenglish.com.au, where you will get full access to these entire episodes of this series and much, much more. You can go check that out using the links below, or just go to aussieenglish.com.au. Once again, thank you so much for joining me, mate, and I will see you next time. Peace.